During your long run, general rule of thumb, 30 to 60 grams of carbohydrates per hour. Couple little nuances to that. If it's not a super high intense run and if it's less than 2 hours, you can probably get away less, like closer to the 30 grams per hour. But if you are running at higher paces, maybe you're doing some threshold work or some intervals during your long run, then you should probably push that 60 grams per hour. I will add though, for your marathon, if you do plan to have 60 grams of carbohydrates per hour during the marathon, you do need to train at that level during your training runs. So even if it is a little bit of a lighter or lower intensity long run and you do plan to run a marathon or even longer with 60 grams of carbs per hour, then start to practice that as well.
Hi guys, welcome back to the Adaptive Zone podcast. My name is Matthew Boyd. I'm a physiotherapist and running coach. If you enjoyed today's episode, please don't forget to like and subscribe. And if you're so inclined, share it with a friend. Today, we're going to be talking again to Stephanie Small. She is a registered dietitian who specializes in helping endurance athletes. And she's going to be talking to us about fueling, both for your running workouts and for your running races. So this is a very practical episode. And the reason we decided to record this episode was to add it to my Running Fundamentals course, which is a course which, as it sounds like, teaches you the fundamentals of running, exercise, performance, all that kind of stuff. And the reason we're going to put this in is because if you're not fueling properly, you're not going to perform very well. The rest of the course is all about pacing and training zones, heart rate zones, avoiding injuries, running technique. We're going to be adding some stuff on hydration soon. It's going to be a course that basically expands over time and it's all free. So if that sounds like something you would be interested in, just click the link in the description. Put your email address in, you'll get one module each week. Anyway, that's enough out of me. Let's get on with it. So, Steph, welcome back to the Adaptive Zone podcast. How are you doing?
Yeah, I'm good. Thank you for having me back.
So, just for those who didn't catch the previous episodes, could you just quickly tell us a little bit about yourself and your professional work?
Yeah, absolutely. So my name is Stephanie Small, and I currently reside in Toronto. I am attending my second year PhD at the University of Toronto, and I study carbohydrate metabolism specifically, but I'm also a performance dietitian for endurance athletes.
Okay, cool. Good stuff. So today we're going to talk about what to fuel on your runs. Well, on your runs, before your runs, after your runs. So this is a topic that I think is generally not well understood in terms of, people don't really know exactly what to do. So we're going to start with the more obvious stuff and then sort of dig into some of the more nuanced side of it, if that sounds okay to you.
Yeah, absolutely. Go for it.
Okay, so in terms of, let's just start with on the run. So let's say you're going for your long run. What should I eat?
During your long run, general rule of thumb, 30 to 60 grams of carbohydrates per hour. Couple little nuances to that. If it's not a super high intense run and if it's less than 2 hours, you can probably get away closer to the 30 grams per hour. But if you are running at higher paces, maybe you're doing some threshold work or some intervals during your long run, then you should probably push that 60 grams per hour. I will add though, for your marathon, if you do plan to have 60 grams of carbohydrates per hour during the marathon, you do need to train at that level during your training runs. So even if it is a little bit of a lighter or lower intensity long run and you do plan to run a marathon or even longer with 60 grams of carbs per hour, then start to practice that as well.
Okay. So if we start, did you say 30 or 60 grams?
30 to 60 grams is the general rule of thumb, but if you plan to race at 60 grams per hour, no matter how long your run is on your long run days or how intense, you should be practicing at that 60 grams per hour.
Okay, so let's say we're going to target 60 grams per hour. What does that look like? And what do you use to hit 60 grams per hour on your runs?
Yeah. For me personally, I'm a huge fan of gels. They're super easy to carry and I can scarf them down pretty quickly, not a lot of chewing. But we really want to keep it simple carbohydrates. So most sports companies nowadays do have gels or beverages or even like the chewing blocks, if those are options as well. If you want to go more of the whole foods route, you can take a look at things like fruit, rice balls, potatoes, and when I say fruit, mainly dried fruit that you can carry. But at the end of the day, as long as it's a very simple carbohydrate and easily digestible.
Okay. Well, that doesn't sound very healthy, Steph. So is this going to make me fat?
Absolutely not. When it comes to carbohydrates, I know it gets a bad rep per se, and I know we want to stay away from all these added sugars and those sort of things. But in all honesty, added sugar or sugars in general are not inherently bad. Your body is going to absorb them, digest them, and use them as fuel pretty quickly. Now, if you're overeating, that's when you can, gain extra weight. But as long as you're eating at maintenance calories, you're fueling for your runs, you shouldn't gain weight. And you should also see increases in performance because you're having carbohydrates to fuel those runs.
But if I'm running because I want to lose weight, would this not prevent me from losing weight?
Absolutely not. So if you're running at a caloric deficit because you are trying to lose weight, you're eating less calories than you're burning out, you still need a fuel for these runs. The reason why you want to fuel for these runs is because if you're running at a depleted state, you're increasing your risk of injury, you're not going to recover very well, and you're just not going to perform or feel very great at all before, during, or after those runs. But that could potentially be a whole nother topic, as I don't tend to encourage high training volumes of running to be advantageous for weight loss, but that's a whole nother story.
That does sound like a can of worms that we could open on a different day,
Yeah.
perhaps. But your general rule of thumb as a starting point is that even if you're losing weight, you should be fueling your runs, and you should do it with simple carbohydrates, things like gels, or if you're going to go with food, like dried raisins and that kind of thing.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. And do you recommend people start with things like gels, or is there an advantage to using a more natural food source?
Yes. So sports supplements and gels and those sort of products, they are proven and tested to be very effective, and most of my clients see less stomach issues or GI related issues when they use those products, because those products are just carbohydrates, and they're also the carbohydrates in the right ratios. So we have different types of carbohydrates. Specifically for fueling, we most commonly will use glucose and fructose. Those are just the very basic forms of carbohydrates. When it comes to glucose, we can absorb it very well, very quickly, up to 60 grams per hour. Fructose, we can consume up to 30 grams per hour. And so if you take fruit, for example, its primary source of carbohydrate is going to be fructose. So if you eat too much fructose, you may lead to GI upset and distress, right? So when you have these formulated sports products, they've already done that math on the back end, and they know what's in the products, and they've put really good ratios of glucose and fructose within those products. And also Go ahead. No.
I was just going to ask, is it generally a better plan to start with things like that and then maybe move to more things like dates, raisins, rice balls and things like that once you've gotten used to making sure you're hitting that 30 to 60 grams per hour with products that were designed for the purpose of eating them while you're running, and then maybe move to other things later if you want to, but start with the gels, the products?
If that is feasible, I like to encourage it because I know what's in those products specifically, but I know those products are a little bit more expensive. Some people do prefer the whole food route, so it's not necessarily right or wrong to do one over the other. But I do practice that if you choose to use whole foods first, such as dried fruits, rice balls, and potatoes, because they have other ingredients such as, some fiber to a degree, you don't know quite the ratio of glucose to fructose in there, there's estimated equations and whatnot, you are at a little bit of a higher risk to experience some stomach or gut issues during those runs. So I typically will start at a smaller dose with whole food products.
Okay. And if someone is not running any of their longer runs first my question would be how long does this run have to be before you need to worry about taking on 60 grams of carbs per hour?
Yes, so any sort of carbohydrates that you should intake is typically when your runs are longer than 90 minutes. So once you hit 90 minutes, you've used your muscle stores of carbohydrates, and you need to have some type of carbohydrates coming from somewhere else, mainly through the food we eat. From the 90 to 2 hour mark, most people do very well with just 30 grams per hour. If you are going beyond 2 hours, you should increase above the 30 grams per hour. And if you're training for that marathon distance, then I do encourage up to 60.
Okay. So let's go with gels because they're, I think, most familiar to people and it gives people a good idea of how much you're actually talking about here. So let's say we're going 60 grams per hour and we're going to do a long run of like 2 hours. So it's over that 90-minute mark. How many gels is that?
Most gels typically will have 25 grams of carbohydrates. So you're looking at 2 to 3 gels, and you may not get exactly 60 grams, but you can get pretty close to it. So most common recommendation is 1 gel every 30 to 45 minutes.
Okay.
If we're aiming for the 60 grams per hour.
Okay. Now, so 1 gel is 25 grams, and I want to hit about 60 grams per hour. So it's 2 to 3 per hour. And I'm going to run a marathon. My marathon takes me about 4 hours. So this sounds like a lot of gels. I'm not that good at math, but let's say it's 3 times 4. That'd be 12. So I had to eat 12 gels on my 4-hour marathon?
Yes, it's a personal preference. I typically will rely solely on gels, but you do have alternatives and you can switch it up. So you can use beverages as alternatives. You can use blocks, you can use whole foods. So some of my athletes that experience flavor fatigue or don't like the texture of gels too much, then we can use alternative sources or kind of swap it out. I do like using beverages when possible because those are very easily to put down.
Okay, could you give me an example? Let's say we're starting point. I've got this 4-hour marathon and I've got, let's say, 3 gels per hour to hit that 60 grams. And we think that might be too much gel. So we're going to try and maybe incorporate some sports drinks or maybe some little Cliff Blocks or, the gummies or whatever they are. Like, what would you suggest I start with and how could we arrange it? Like, how many and how much of each thing?
That's actually a personal preference, as most of those products are very simple carbohydrates. They're going to digest pretty similarly. Something I would advocate, though, is that if you are going into a beverage, be cautious of how much fluids you are taking in with gels. So when you do consume fluids, it's going to decrease the rate of digestion. So it's going to go from the stomach to the small intestines very quickly. The small intestines is where we absorb all those carbohydrates. So if you're drinking a lot of fluids, you're just going to have a rush of fluids in the small intestines, and that can cause like the runner's trots and some cramps and stuff like that. So if you are switching from gels to beverages, try not to mix them or cross them over too much. So have a gel at the 30-minute mark and then have your beverage, at the 60-minute mark, right? So don't have them too close together. But again, with that being said, your gut is very adaptable. And if you train, and you can train your gut slowly to tolerate both the gels and beverages, you can do that as well.
And what about switching from gels to something like gummies? Like, how many gummies are we talking about here in real life?
Really depends on the type of gummies. I've personally used the Welch's gummies if we've gone that route, or you can do things like Cliff Blocks, which are also gummies as well. Those are very similar to gels. The only thing different is you have a gelatin to kind of bind it and make it more of a gummy. So that one's a harder to answer because gels are so varied in how many carbohydrates they hold. So it depends on what type of gummy you're using or block.
Okay. I seem to remember 1 gel equating to 3 gummies, like little blocks. Like there was 6 in the pack. I think it was Cliff, and there was 6 of them in there. And I think I remember 3 of them equated to a gel. But I guess what you're saying is you'd have to work out, look at the back of the pack, how many grams of carbs per whatever serving they use. It might be 3 or 4 gummies. And then take your 60 grams per hour. How many gummies is that? And if you want to use partially gummies and partially gels, then you would just practice that. But the goal is to hit that 60 grams of carbs per hour. Does that sound about right?
Yep, absolutely.
And then you can experiment. And if you're going to incorporate sports drinks, you can do that. But you would try and consume them at different points. So maybe at, 30 minutes you have your gel and 60 minutes you have some sports drink and do it that way. Okay. All right. I think that answers that question. And, you know, I've been working on this with a few athletes recently, and they've been like, oh man, that's a lot. I'm going to be sick. And especially when they're doing longer runs, 2, 3 hours plus. Um, where, if people aren't doing any at all, like where should they start and can they train this? And how long does it take to train it?
Yeah, very good question. Yes, you can absolutely train it. Most of the time, if an athlete has never had any sort of carbohydrates during their run, I will start off with something that I know they have in their daily diet and that's comfortable for them, or maybe we'll just do a test run for a gel and start with something as small as 10 to 15 grams per hour. So
Okay.
it could be a half of a gel, not the full one block or something extremely small, just to see how that works. And something I do like to preface is that if you've never had carbohydrates during your run, or if you experience GI issues during your run, it's going to happen. Like if you eat something and you get nauseous, have to go to the bathroom, the washroom, it's going to happen on occasions. That doesn't mean what you did was wrong. You just may have to trial and error it again, right? And once you do that a couple times, slowly build up how much you can handle. You can actually, honestly, the sky's the limit. They've actually done research where they've had 120 grams per hour. That's quite unnecessary, and that was done in cyclists. But you can work your way up to 30 to 60 grams per hour. It may seem impossible and hard at first, but give yourself time before an actual race to practice during your long runs and build up your tolerance. As far as
How,
duration, oops, sorry.
I was just going to ask, how long is it realistic? Like, say someone is like, they started on 15 grams per hour from gummies and they're struggling. Like, how long to really get to that 60 grams per hour? And obviously it's going to be a bit different, but just ballpark. Do they need to train this for like a whole year? Or is it just like a couple of weeks? Like, how long does it take to get their body to adapt to that challenge?
Yeah. On average, 3 months. If you have more of a sensitive stomach, 6 months
Okay.
is what I just based off of experience with athletes. So it's really person independent, but like 3 to 6 months seems to be a common range.
Well, we're recording this in February, so now is a good time to start.
Yes, especially for those spring marathons.
Yeah. And do you advocate that people do this like year round, or do they, is this always part of the training, or is it only when you're hitting higher volumes of training?
Always. Well,
Okay.
I may be biased in a dietitian, but I'm a huge fan of fueling. So anytime you're having a run or physical activity greater than 90 minutes, go ahead and start that fueling.
Okay. Well, I think that handles within run and within race fueling. And I think it goes without saying, but I'll say it anyway, that whatever you're going to do for your race, you should be doing on your training runs as well and using the same product.
Absolutely.
I did have one clarifying question. I'll often use like DIY gels. I have a little link that I send my athletes because it gets expensive, right? If you're doing a 3 hour long run, it's 3 gels per hour. There's 9 gels for a long run at the weekend. It's like what, $3 a gel. So it's like, okay, it's like $27 to go for a long run. So what do you think of DIY gels and what are some options there? And are they a bad idea? Is there a benefit to going with the specifically crafted product?
No, no. If I'm a huge advocate for DIY or simple methods. So like I said, I use Welch's fruit snacks because you can get a whole box at Costco for about $20. But yeah, DIYs are great. Again, you have a little bit more variability in the ingredients. But if you're using a combination of like maybe some Jello plus some simple sugar of sorts and some fruit juice, keeps it really simple, not too much variability in the ingredients. You train with it, absolutely feasible to use that during your runs.
And what do you think of my table syrup and coffee that we
The
discussed before? So I get table syrup and then I put
Yes.
a little bit of Gatorade or coffee in it and then do this. And then I drink that. It's absolutely disgusting, but I could hit those grams of carbs pretty easily and I seem to tolerate it, although I don't really enjoy it. It's very cheap. Is there,
Yeah.
is there a negative side effect to my health from that?
No, because you're so physically active, if we wanted to talk about health from like insulin sensitivity and resistance perspective, it's not going to be an issue.
Hmm.
But no, because at the end of the day, when you eat carbohydrates, they're going to digest the exact same way into your bloodstream and you're going to use them the exact same way. So no, go for it. As long as it doesn't make you nauseous or sick and you can tolerate the taste of it, go for it.
So there's not really a significant difference between me doing that ridiculous thing with table syrup or someone using maple syrup or using like dried fruits or gels or gummies. What about candy? Like, things that you buy at the store, like, like regular candy. I'm blanking on a name. Skips. Do you know what I mean? Like, is there any disadvantage to using things like that and just checking the back of the pack and seeing how many you need?
No, absolutely go for it. I will say with more like the sour candies and stuff, I would stay away from that. Citric acid can cause an increased amount of stomach acid in the stomach and cause like heartburn and stuff during your runs. But if it's something without like the sour aspect to it and you can tolerate it, absolutely go for it. They used to, in like the 70s and 80s, it wasn't unknown to have things like Skittles with Diet Coke during marathons.
Okay.
Or not Diet Coke, regular Coke.
So I guess it's just preference, right? You've got your grams of carbs targets and you just have to find your way of hitting them.
Yep, absolutely.
Okay, cool. So I think that takes care of within run fueling. What about pre-run?
Yes. Pre-run's my favorite because I think most athletes do struggle with it to some degree. General rule of thumb is have a meal low in fat, high in carbohydrates, and moderate protein about 2 to 3 hours prior to your run. Okay? If you're having a run less than 90 minutes, you can get away with not having a snack right beforehand. Unless you're feeling a little hungry, it won't hurt you either. But if you're having a run longer than 90 minutes, have that meal plus something about 15 to 30 minutes out. So very simple carbohydrates like a piece of fruit, a piece of toast with some jam on it. Very simple that is easy to digest. Now, if you haven't had a meal within the 2 to 3 hour mark, try to have something within the hour. And again, keep it very simple, mostly carbohydrates.
So mostly this will come up in the morning for people. So let's say I do my long runs on a Sunday, and let's say it's the first thing I do in the morning. Do I have to get up, have a big breakfast, and wait 2 hours to go for my run?
Great question. Really short answer is no. And there's a couple ways we can modify it and get around it. So if you are an early morning riser and you go for a run first thing, at least give yourself 30 minutes of some type of carbohydrate beforehand. I like to have 30 to 45 grams of carbohydrates. So this could be oatmeal, toast. If you're not a good breakfast eater, it could be fruit juice that you can just chug down real quick. But again, very low in fat, not a lot of protein or a lot of fiber. Keep it really simple and digestible. On top of that, since you are coming from an overnight fast, there are studies that show that having a higher carbohydrate meal right before bed can actually benefit you for that pre-run as well. But with that being said, if you have that nighttime meal, I still encourage something beforehand in the morning.
Cool. And if listeners want to get a little more detail on that, our previous episode on carb loading, I think it'd be a really good one. So I'll link that into the description. Okay, so that deals with before and during. And how about after runs and training runs and races?
Yes. Refueling as soon as you possibly can is absolutely crucial. So after you stop running, your body wants to replenish your carbohydrate stores as soon as possible, specifically in the muscle. The longer that you wait after a run or a workout, the harder it is for your body to replenish those stores. So I encourage having some type of carbohydrate and protein combo within an hour of that workout. So this could be an actual meal. So if you're good to have dinner or your breakfast within the hour, go for it. If you're not someone who's that hungry right afterwards, then I encourage something small. And most of the time, 15 to 30 grams of protein, 30 grams of carbohydrates are really good balance. And so this could be a protein shake, protein bar. It could be a granola bar and an egg, something just really small that you can get in even if you're not super hungry.
I'll often go with leftovers, from the night before, and it's just in the fridge, and because there's usually some left over, I'll just stick it in the microwave when I get back from my long run, which I do fuel now, thanks to you. I've got much better at all of this stuff. And, I get back from my long run, I stick it in the microwave, I eat that, and you can get in the habit. It's quite easy. And I used to just kind of do nothing which is, as we talked about previously, a terrible idea. It made me feel really bad. So I think that's pretty straightforward. Do people have to eat more generally on days where they're doing, say, more difficult training sessions? So let's say your long run is over. Let's just say it's a long run for you, so you find it quite draining. Or maybe you're doing like a hill intervals or a sprint intervals that you find really challenging. Should people eat differently on those days to their other days where maybe they're having a recovery day and they're not doing anything, or they're just having a light, zone 1, zone 2 run? Should they do things differently on different days?
Yeah, really great question. So on days that are more high intense or longer runs, greater than 90 minutes type of workouts, your plate should be comprised mostly of carbohydrates. So if we look up, if you Google training plate specifically for athletes, you'll see 50% of your plate should be carbohydrates for those hard training days. Quarter of it's going to be protein, quarter of it fruits and vegetables for those antioxidants to also help with recovery. If you're having a moderate training day, then you're going to have a third of your plate carbohydrates, quarter of it protein, third of it fruits and vegetables. If it's more of a rest day, unless you had a long or hard run the day before you weren't adequately able to refuel from, then you can have a low training day plate, which is a quarter of your plate carbs, quarter protein, half fruits and vegetables.
Okay, cool. I think those training plates that you referenced, I've got copies of when we did discuss this before, so I'll put those in the show notes for people to have a look at, because they are quite helpful in terms of just like a visual of what you're looking at.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay. And then, for me, and I think for a lot of people that we've worked with, we discover that across the week, they're actually under fooding, right? Like not just under fueling, but like they're just not eating enough. We discussed when you and I worked on this with me, what are some signs that people might be under fueling generally that they could look out for?
Yes. So very interesting. There's been a couple of reviews and studies that show that if you're under fueling, it will not directly reflect performance. Long-term under fueling will impact performance, but if it's short-term throughout the week, you may not see decrements in performance, but what you will commonly feel, you'll feel fatigue or low energy throughout the day. You may have like that 3 o'clock crash or feel the need for a nap. Sleep becomes impaired. You're moody or irritable. Or if you're just overtly hungry in the evening, so you have these big cravings and you feel like you can't stop eating, are the most common ones I experience with clients.
It can be very sneaky, that kind of stuff, because sometimes we'll see the snacking as like weakness. Do you know what I mean? It's like, I'm just being impulsive. And the moodiness, the crankiness, can often be like stress, right? You might think I'm stressed and just tired because work and life is busy, whereas actually maybe you're not eating enough, and that's part of the problem. So I guess something you could do would be to just try and, what I did, after we worked together, was just started adding some more, routine snacks into my day. I was trying to increase my caloric intake by about 300 to 400. Mm-hmm. And that worked really well. And a lot of the problems I was having with like crashing on runs, just randomly, and that kind of thing, got a lot better. And I suppose you increase it and you feel pretty similar, then maybe it's the stress and the work or something like that. And if you increase it and you do feel better, then you know that you're just not eating enough. Is that about right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I've actually had clients report that when they eat more throughout the day and throughout the week, they actually feel less stressed and feel less moody, and that overall impacts their day. But yeah, absolutely. We live in a world now where we have a lot of work. We're typically busy throughout the week, and combine that with high intensity or just high volume training, such as training for a marathon or half marathon, your hunger and fullness cues are not as you can't rely on them as much because they're skewed or impacted by other things. So increasing your knowledge and awareness of your food and how much you need as an athlete can be a very important part of the process, because you may not be hungry throughout your workday, but that doesn't mean you need to fuel, because you may have an evening run, you may have done a long run the day before, and you haven't refueled from those things. So I encourage you to practice increasing how much food you're having for your meals or adding another snack, just to make sure you're having adequate fuel to recover and to perform very well.
And there's something you do with my athletes when I get them to meet with you is to you get them to quantify their training, and then you give them a range, like their weekly training load, and then you give them a range of caloric intake. How do you do that? Is it very individual, or is there more like ballparks that people can work from, or like a formula?
Yeah, there's ballpark formulas that you can work with. So once I've calculated someone's basal metabolic rate, and if you wanted to, you can just Google basal metabolic rate calculator online, and ones come up. And then you multiply it by an activity factor. So an activity factor is this range of about this 5 different categories. You pick one of those numbers, multiply that by your basal metabolic rate. And so the reason why I do ranges is because physical activity is going to change on a day-to-day basis. And also, too, there's been studies to show that these activity factors may not be super representative for endurance athletes. So you'll see me go beyond a couple of activity factors, especially in peak marathon training. I may do an activity factor of 2 to 2.2, and the highest that the scale goes is actually 1.9. And this is just based off of some theories and collaborative experience with other endurance dietitians.
I see. So do you use like a website to plug these numbers in and then add a little bit more? Is that something we could share with people?
I have an Excel spreadsheet I use, and I've actually shared it with other clients, and I'm happy to share that.
Cool. Yeah, if you could give me like what do you call it? A public shareable link thing.
Yep.
I'll put that in the show note. I'm going to have to go and check. I said a bunch of resources I've committed to sharing. I have to go and listen to this again and make sure I do it all. So I think that covers everything. Is there anything, specific misconceptions or problems you run into around fueling, training, and racing that you think you'd like to address that we haven't discussed?
No, honestly, the big one is eating consistently throughout the day, which we covered. And I always encourage people to be intuitive athletes. So getting the knowledge of how to fuel yourself based off of your physical activity doesn't mean you have to necessarily count everything or count calories, but having that knowledge of the training plates or pre and post fueling. So you may not necessarily be hungry, but you as an athlete know to recover and to perform better for your next session, you need to do X, Y, Z. So you just do it anyways and create the environment to where it becomes second nature so that you can be more of an intuitive athlete.
Yeah, that's a nice term. I've found from my own experience and working with my athletes, both in terms of pacing, heart rate zones, fluid, sodium, fueling, diet, like strength training, like all of these things, you start with like a ballpark of what you think based on something like what you just said, like okay, these are the guidelines, 60 grams per hour, use this calculation to work out how much food you need across the week. You start there and then you sort of iterate from there to get something that suits you rather than just saying, oh, just listen to your body. But that can be extremely difficult. And what I find is that some people will estimate things about right, whether it's pace or hydration or fueling. And some people will be absolutely miles away and have no idea. And I was certainly that when it comes to fueling. I was miles away. And when I talked to you, had a plan, started executing a plan, felt better. Now I know a bit more and I can be a bit more intuitive. So I don't know, I've backed off my calories a bit recently because I know my just training volume is just not as high at the minute as it usually is. And that is that building that intuition now. I have some experience and knowledge to draw on so that I can actually make good decisions.
Yes, absolutely.
All right, that was wonderful. We're going to keep it brief today. Thank you, Steph, as usual.
Thank you.
And we'll have you on again soon to pick your brain for something else.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Have a great day.